The Arctic, a place where the world feels suspended in time. It's a vast white desert where temperatures drop so low that the air itself feels sharp against your lungs, and silence stretches endlessly over icebergs and glaciers. For three fishermen, Mike, Tom, and Jack, this frozen wilderness was more than a destination. It was a way of life. They were drawn not only by the promise of a good catch, but also by the thrill of the unpredictable, the raw power of nature that demanded both respect and courage. Mike, the eldest of the group, had been fishing Arctic waters for over a decade. His grizzled beard was flecked with frost as he stood at the wheel of the boat, eyes narrowed against the cold wind. "Remember," he muttered to the younger two, "the ice can turn on you when you least expect it." Tom, tall and wiry with a relentless sense of humor, shot back, "That's what you always say, Mike. Like the ice has it out for us." Jack, the youngest of the group, laughed nervously. It was his first time venturing this far north, and though he tried to hide it, there was a flicker of anxiety in his blue eyes. The boat, a sturdy old vessel reinforced for these brutal conditions, groaned softly as it pushed through slush and ice floes. The waters here were treacherous, partially frozen, unpredictable, and largely uncharted. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the ice in hues of orange and pink. It was beautiful, but the fishermen knew better than to be lulled by it. The Arctic, for all its majesty, was not forgiving to those who let down their guard. Hours passed as the men worked methodically, casting nets and hauling in fish. The boat rocked gently as they brought in their catch, Arctic char, halibut and cod, their silvery bodies glinting against the frost-covered deck. It was good work, honest work, and the thrill of a full net helped stave off the cold. Mike, ever the pragmatist, kept glancing at the edges of the ice. The floes were closing in tighter. "We'll need to move soon," he said, his voice firm. "Don't let the ice trap us." The temperature dropped further as the day wore on. By now the cold seeped into everything, into the crevices of their boat, into their bones, even into their thoughts. Tom rubbed his hands together, breath misting into the frigid air. "Feels like the Arctic's biting back tonight," he muttered. Mike didn't respond. His eyes were focused, scanning the waters for any signs of danger. In these remote areas, a wrong turn could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Then it happened. A sound echoed through the hull of the boat, low and deep, almost like a heartbeat against the metal. The three men froze, eyes widening. Thud. It came again, louder this time, followed by the unsettling sound of water slapping against the side of the boat. Mike's instincts kicked in immediately. "Something's out there," he said sharply. Tom and Jack peered over the railing into the dark water below. At first, there was nothing, just ripples spreading across the surface. But then they saw it, a dorsal fin, slicing through the water like a blade. It was massive, far larger than any of them expected. "Is that a shark?" Jack's voice trembled. Greenland sharks, they knew, inhabited these waters. They were ancient creatures, slow-moving yet powerful, perfectly adapted to the freezing depths. The shark circled the boat, its movements deliberate and menacing. With every lap around the vessel, the tension grew heavier, pressing on the men like the icy air. Then came the first strike. The shark rammed the boat with startling force, causing it to shudder violently. The men stumbled, grabbing onto whatever they could to stay upright. "What's it doing?" Tom shouted, fear cracking his voice. Mike gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "It's testing us, trying to see if we're food." The second strike came harder. This time a sickening splintering sound echoed through the boat as the hull groaned under the pressure. Jack looked over the edge and recoiled. He could see the shadowy outline of the shark's massive body beneath the surface. "It's trying to break us apart," he whispered, his voice almost drowned by the howl of the wind. The men scrambled into action, grabbing tools, ropes, anything they could find to brace the boat. But deep down, they knew the odds were against them. The ice was closing in, boxing them into a shrinking patch of water, and the shark was relentless. Its attacks grew bolder, the strikes more aggressive. Water started to seep into the boat, icy and unforgiving. For a brief moment there was silence, a lull that almost felt like mercy. The men held their breath, hoping the shark had given up. But then, it surfaced. A monstrous head broke through the water, jaws gaping to reveal rows of jagged teeth. The shark slammed into the boat again, this time with enough force to send Tom sprawling to the deck. Jack pulled him up, panic evident on his face. "It's going to sink us, Mike," he yelled. Mike didn't respond. His mind was clouded by the weight of realization. They were trapped. The boat couldn't withstand much more, and with no other vessels in sight, there would be no rescue. "Keep calm," Mike said through gritted teeth. "We're not dead yet." The shark disappeared beneath the waves again, but its absence was just as terrifying as its presence. The men huddled together, their breaths shallow, the cold creeping into their fingertips and faces. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity. They could hear the ice shifting around them, groaning as if mocking their plight. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Mike saw something on the ice. A shape, large, white and unmistakable, moving toward them. At first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Tom and Jack followed his gaze, and their eyes widened in disbelief. A polar bear. It stood tall on the edge of the ice, its massive paws crunching softly as it moved closer. Its fur glistened in the weak light, and its black eyes were locked on the boat. The men froze, their fear of the shark now mingling with the primal dread of the Arctic's greatest predator. "A bear?" Jack whispered hoarsely. "We're trapped between a shark and a bear." The polar bear stopped at the edge of the ice, seemingly assessing the situation. The shark's dorsal fin cut through the water once more, its movements more frantic now. The men exchanged looks, confusion and terror mingling in their expressions. Why was the bear here? What was it going to do? The Arctic had already shown them its ferocity. Now it seemed it was about to show them something else. The three men stood frozen, their breath visible in the icy air as the polar bear approached the edge of the ice floe. It was massive, a creature sculpted by the Arctic itself. Its powerful body seemed to radiate strength, and its white fur almost blended with the snow and ice. The only thing betraying its presence were its dark, intelligent eyes, locked on the fishing boat. Jack stumbled back slightly, gripping the side of the boat as panic began to rise. "Mike! That bear, it's huge! What do we do? Do we move? Do we shout? Do we—" "Quiet," Mike hissed sharply, raising his hand to silence the younger man. Mike's instincts told him that making noise or sudden movements might provoke the bear. They were already dealing with a shark relentlessly battering their vessel. The last thing they needed was to anger a hungry predator. Yet Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something about this bear was different. It wasn't charging, wasn't roaring. It just stood there, staring. Tom, trying to stay calm, whispered, "It's like it's watching us." "But why? Does it think we're food? Polar bears don't usually hesitate like this." Mike didn't answer. He was too focused on the bear, on the way it was tilting its head ever so slightly, as if studying the boat and its desperate occupants. The wind howled across the ice, sending chills through their bones, but the bear didn't flinch. It took a step closer, its paws crunching audibly against the frozen ground, then paused again. The shark's fin disappeared below the water momentarily, but the men knew it was still circling. "Listen," Mike said suddenly, his voice low but commanding. "It's not attacking. Let's just hold our ground and see what it does." Jack's eyes widened. "Hold our ground? That's a polar bear. It could tear this boat apart like paper." Mike shot him a hard look. "And running gets us where? Into the freezing water with that shark waiting for us. Sit still." Jack swallowed hard and nodded, though his hands shook. Tom sat down on the deck, his knees pulled to his chest, muttering something about how this was the craziest fishing trip of his life. Silence stretched on, each second feeling longer than the last. The tension was unbearable, like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. Then, as if responding to some invisible signal, the polar bear took a bold step onto the ice closer to the boat. Its massive paws thudded against the frozen ground. With each step, the boat seemed to shrink, the men feeling smaller and more helpless against this towering force of nature. Its black eyes locked onto Mike, unwavering. The shark chose that moment to return, its dark silhouette gliding ominously beneath the water before surfacing. With shocking speed, the shark slammed into the side of the boat again, its blow so powerful that it sent the vessel tilting to one side. The men cried out, clutching anything they could to keep from falling. Water splashed onto the deck, icy and bitterly cold. "It's trying to capsize us," Tom shouted. Mike braced himself, his teeth gritted, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. "Stay low." But then something extraordinary happened. The bear, who had been silently observing until now, let out a low, rumbling growl that echoed across the ice and water. The sound was deep and primal, a warning that sent a chill through the men, not just because of its power, but because it wasn't directed at them. It was aimed at the shark. The bear took another step forward, its enormous form now mere feet from the edge of the ice closest to the boat. The shark, as if sensing the presence of a new predator, hesitated for the first time. Its circling slowed, and its dorsal fin dropped deeper into the water. The men watched, stunned, as the bear growled again, this time louder, a sound that seemed to reverberate through their chests. Is it scaring the shark off?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Mike didn't answer, but the look on his face was one of awe. This was no ordinary polar bear. The shark struck the boat one last time, but this time with noticeably less force, as though unsure of its aggression. The bear leaned forward on the ice, its massive paws curling into the edge, and suddenly the situation shifted. With a loud splash, the shark surfaced again, its sleek form moving quickly, but not toward the boat. It began to veer away. The men could see its dark shadow cutting through the water, retreating into the deeper parts of the frozen sea. "It's leaving," Tom said in disbelief. "The shark's leaving." The men sat there, wide-eyed, trying to process what had just happened. A polar bear, nature's apex predator of the ice, had somehow confronted and scared off a shark. A moment ago they had felt trapped, doomed. Now the water was still, and the shark was gone. The bear didn't leave, though. It remained on the ice, its large form unmoving, staring at the men with an expression that seemed almost knowing. It wasn't the look of an animal hunting prey. It was something deeper, something Mike couldn't quite place. And then it hit him. Mike's mind flashed back to a memory from a trip up here 2 winters ago. That time he had been alone, stranded near the same icy region after engine trouble with his boat. It had been one of the worst storms he'd ever faced, and he'd stumbled across a starving polar bear, little more than skin and bones. The bear had been curled up near the edge of the ice, weak, its ribs visible through its ragged fur. Mike had made a fire nearby, using what little fuel and wood he had, and cooked up a small portion of his catch. He remembered looking into the bear's weary eyes as he tossed it scraps of fish. The bear hadn't moved much, just watched him as if barely holding on. Mike hadn't stayed long. He was able to repair his boat and leave shortly after, but he'd never forgotten that moment, the way the bear's eyes had lingered on him. Now, as Mike stared into the eyes of the polar bear on the ice, realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. "Guys," he said quietly, "I think I know this bear." Tom and Jack turned to him, their faces filled with confusion. "What?" Tom said. "What are you talking about?" Mike didn't look away from the bear. I think I fed him once, 2 years ago. I found a starving polar bear near here and gave him some of my catch. It couldn't even stand up back then, but You think this is the same bear?" Jack interrupted, his voice disbelieving. "Mike, come on." Mike didn't answer. The bear had taken a step closer to the edge of the ice, lowering its head as if to examine the men more closely. Its presence didn't feel threatening now. It felt protective, almost familiar. "I don't care how crazy it sounds," Mike said, his voice steady. "I think this bear remembers me." The men fell silent, their earlier fear replaced by awe. The Arctic was vast, unforgiving, and seemingly indifferent to human life. But here, in this frozen nowhere, something remarkable had happened. An unspoken connection had been forged between man and beast. A kindness returned when it was needed most. The polar bear gave one final long stare at Mike before backing away from the edge of the ice. It turned slowly, its powerful frame moving with surprising grace, and began to walk across the frozen landscape, disappearing into the distance. Mike and his friends watched it go, the silence of the Arctic settling over them once more. For a long while, none of them spoke. The wind howled faintly, the boat rocked gently, and the shark was gone. Jack finally broke the silence, his voice soft. "Did we just get saved by a polar bear?" Mike nodded slowly. Yeah, we did." And in that moment, the Arctic didn't feel quite so empty anymore. The boat drifted in near silence on the icy Arctic waters. The shark was gone, the water calm again, but the 3 men sat frozen, not from the cold, but from the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. Mike's words echoed in their minds. "I think this bear remembers me." Jack, still leaning against the edge of the boat, rubbed his gloved hands together, as if trying to summon warmth, except no amount of heat could calm the chill of amazement running down his spine. "Mike, what do you mean it remembers you? Polar bears don't. They're not like that." Mike turned to Jack and Tom, his eyes intense yet softened by something deeper, something emotional. "I know it sounds impossible, but animals aren't as simple as we think. They do remember kindness. They remember survival. That bear, I swear it's the same one I fed a couple of years ago." Tom's brows knitted together, his face a picture of disbelief and wonder. "So let me get this straight. You're saying that a polar bear, an Arctic predator for crying out loud, just scared off a shark to save us because you tossed it some scraps 2 years ago?" Mike nodded slowly, gazing at the now empty horizon where the bear had disappeared. "It wasn't just scraps, Tom. That bear was dying. It was starving, bones sticking out of its fur. I was stuck out here alone on a trip, just like this, fixing my boat during a storm. When I found it, I couldn't leave it. I shared some fish and stayed near it all night. I didn't think it'd survive, honestly. It barely moved, but when I left the next morning, it watched me go. I'll never forget those eyes." Silence hung heavy in the air. The three men processed what they'd just heard, each trying to reconcile the strange and beautiful story Mike was telling. It felt almost mythical, like a story from an old legend, not something that could happen in the unforgiving reality of the Arctic wilderness. "Mike," Jack finally whispered, breaking the quiet, "do you really think that this polar bear remembered you, 2 years later?" Mike let out a breath, the vapor trailing through the icy air. "Jack, I don't just think it, I know it. Animals have a way of remembering things that matter. That moment when I helped it mattered to it." Tom leaned back against the cold boat railing, staring at the white expanse of ice and snow that stretched endlessly around them. "So what then? You're saying kindness travels? Across species? Across time? You're telling me that your small act saved us from a shark?" "Exactly," Mike said softly. "Sometimes you don't know how far kindness can reach until it comes back to you." The men fell quiet again, but this time the silence was contemplative, not stunned. The Arctic seemed different now, not just a harsh and brutal landscape, but something alive, something more deeply connected to every living thing within it. Jack and Tom didn't argue anymore. Somewhere in their hearts they felt it too, the unshakable weight of a miracle. The three of them sat together on the icy boat deck, their exhaustion catching up with them. Tom reached for his thermos of tea, his hand still shaking slightly as he poured it out. They each took a cup, the warmth spreading through them like life itself. The tea felt more valuable now, as if they were sipping on gratitude itself. "Think about it, guys," Mike said after a while, breaking the silence. "We're sitting here alive because of something so small. A piece of fish, a little fire. That's all it took to change the course of this day." Jack, who was always the skeptic of the group, finally let out a dry laugh, his breath clouding the freezing air. "You know, Mike, you're going to tell this story and nobody's going to believe a word of it. They'll call you crazy." Mike grinned faintly, his face weathered by the cold, but his eyes alight with something much warmer. "I don't care if they believe it. I believe it. We all do." And that was true. Even Jack, the stubborn doubter, couldn't deny what they had witnessed. A polar bear, nature's most fearsome predator on land, had stepped in like a guardian to protect them from the jaws of death. It was something out of a fable, yet it had happened, right here in front of their own eyes. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting shades of gold and pink across the icy waters, the men noticed something. The bear hadn't wandered completely out of view. Far off on the ice, its massive form was still visible, a distant silhouette against the setting sun. It wasn't leaving them. It was watching. Protecting, perhaps. Mike stood up slowly, as if pulled by something deeper than reason. "I need to do this." "What are you talking about?" Jack asked, rising to his feet, the cold wind biting at his face. Mike didn't answer. He carefully stepped off the boat, his boots sinking slightly into the snow-packed ice. Jack and Tom stared at him, too stunned to stop him. "Mike, are you insane?" Tom finally shouted. "That's still a polar bear." Mike didn't turn back. He kept walking, his hands raised slightly to show he was no threat. His steps were careful, deliberate, as he moved across the ice toward the distant figure of the bear. Each step echoed in his mind, memories of that stormy night, the dying bear, the firelight flickering and the silent understanding they'd shared. The bear, sensing his approach, turned its head to face him. It didn't move, didn't charge, it just watched, waiting. When Mike was close enough to see its eyes, he stopped. The bear's eyes were the same dark, deep and hauntingly intelligent, eyes that seemed to recognize him. Mike swallowed hard, his breath catching in his throat as he raised his voice just loud enough to be heard. "Thank you," he said softly, "for today, for everything." The bear blinked, its breath misting in the cold. Then slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, it raised its massive paw and lowered it again, a movement that seemed deliberate, a gesture. Mike felt tears prick his eyes as the moment washed over him. He had been right. This wasn't just a bear. This was his bear. The bond they'd formed years ago had never been broken. After what felt like an eternity, the bear turned away, its heavy paws crunching against the ice as it walked into the fading light. Mike stood still, watching until the silhouette disappeared completely into the Arctic wilderness. When Mike finally turned back, Tom and Jack were staring at him from the boat, their faces pale and stunned. He made his way back across the ice and climbed aboard, his friends peppering him with questions, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat down, looking out at the empty horizon where the bear had vanished. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he turned to them and smiled. "Some things," he said quietly, "are just meant to be." And as the boat gently rocked in the icy calm, the three of them sat together, forever changed. They would never look at the Arctic, or themselves, the same way again. The boat rocked gently in the frozen Arctic waters, the calm after the chaos feeling almost surreal. Mike, Jack and Tom sat in silence for a while, absorbing everything that had just happened. The sharp bite of the cold wind no longer seemed to bother them, as if the events of the day had numbed them to everything except their own swirling thoughts. It was Mike who finally broke the silence, his voice soft yet resolute. "We have to go back. We need to tell people what happened here." Jack, still processing everything, shook his head and let out a nervous laugh. "Mike, you think anyone's going to believe us? You think they're going to sit down, hear this story and say, 'Yeah, sure, sounds legit. A polar bear fought off a shark and you had a reunion with it like it was some long-lost friend'?" Tom chimed in, his voice full of disbelief but tinged with awe. "Jack's right, Mike. It sounds impossible. People back home barely believe when I tell them the Arctic isn't just an endless sheet of ice. But this, a bear saving us, remembering you from years ago, they'll think we've lost it." Mike looked out at the horizon, the vast expanse of ice glimmering under the faint, pale Arctic sun. "I don't care if they believe it," he said firmly. "I know what happened. We know what happened. That's enough for me. But we owe it to the world to share this." Jack frowned, rubbing his gloved hands together to warm them. "Mike, why does it even matter? We're alive, that's all that counts. Who cares what anyone else thinks?" Mike turned back to face them, his eyes full of something they hadn't seen in him before, a quiet but unshakable conviction. "Because it's not just about us, Jack. Don't you get it? This isn't just a story about three guys in a boat. This is about kindness, about connection, about how the smallest things we do, things we think are meaningless, can come back to us in ways we can't imagine. If that polar bear hadn't remembered me, we'd be dead. Think about that." Tom leaned forward, his expression softening. "So what, you think this is like a message, like fate?" "Maybe it is," Mike replied. "Maybe it's a reminder. Animals, humans, we're not so different. We share this world, and we survive by helping each other. That bear didn't save us because it had to. It saved us because it chose to, because it remembered a single act of kindness I showed it when it was starving. That's why we need to tell this story." The weight of Mike's words hung in the air, sinking deep into their hearts. For the first time, Jack and Tom didn't argue. They couldn't. Whether it was fate, coincidence, or something greater, what they had witnessed was undeniable. The three of them worked to restart the boat's engine. It sputtered and coughed but finally roared to life. As they began the slow journey back to civilization, Mike sat at the front of the boat, staring out at the icy wilderness, lost in thought. His mind wandered back to that moment, the polar bear's paw gently lowering, as if it were acknowledging him, showing gratitude in its own silent way. When they finally reached the nearest Arctic outpost, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the icy plains. The three men stumbled off the boat, exhausted and overwhelmed, but alive. The small team of researchers at the station greeted them, surprised to see their weary faces and broken boat. "What happened out there?" one of the researchers asked, concern etched into his face. The three men looked at each other, unsure of how to start. It was Tom who finally spoke, his voice shaky. "You wouldn't believe us if we told you." Mike added, "But we're going to tell you anyway." And they did. Over cups of steaming coffee in the warmth of the research outpost, the three men recounted every detail of their story. The shark attack, the polar bear's sudden arrival, the way it fought off the shark, as though it had appeared from nowhere just to save them, and then Mike's reunion. The researchers listened in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from disbelief to awe. Finally, one of them leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "You're right, that's hard to believe." "But it's true," Mike insisted. "Every word," Jack added. "We saw it. It happened. That bear, it saved us." The researchers exchanged glances, some clearly skeptical, but one older scientist nodded thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "polar bears are remarkably intelligent. They have incredible memories and survival instincts. I can't say I've heard of anything like this, but I don't know. Nature surprises us all the time." The men stayed at the outpost for a few days, regaining their strength before returning home. Word of their story began to spread, first among the researchers, then to others in the Arctic community. By the time they made it back to civilization, the tale of the bear that saved three men had already started to make waves. Mike, Jack and Tom were invited to share their story on local news stations. The responses were mixed. Some called them heroes, others called them liars. People debated whether it was a hoax or a miracle. Experts weighed in, with some dismissing the story as impossible, while others speculated that perhaps the bear's behavior wasn't as implausible as it seemed. Through it all, Mike remained steadfast. He didn't care about fame or proving himself. He cared about sharing what the experience had taught him. "Kindness matters," he would say in interviews, "even when you think no one notices, even when you think it's forgotten. It matters." Months later, Mike received an invitation to speak at a wildlife conservation conference. Standing before a crowd of scientists, conservationists, and curious onlookers, he told the story one more time, but this time he ended with a call to action. If a polar bear can remember a single act of kindness, then we can too. We share this world with incredible creatures who deserve our respect and care. Protecting them, protecting the balance of this planet, starts with us. The room erupted in applause. Years passed, but the story never faded. Mike's experience inspired documentaries, articles, and even conservation campaigns. The Arctic, once seen only as a harsh, barren land, began to be recognized for its beauty, its life, and its fragile balance. And somewhere, deep in the Arctic wilderness, a lone polar bear roamed the icy plains. Perhaps it no longer remembered Mike's face, or perhaps, in its own quiet way, it carried the memory with it, always a reminder that kindness has a reach far beyond what we can see. For Mike, Jack and Tom, life moved on. They returned to their families, their jobs, their ordinary routines. But they were never quite the same. Mike, especially, felt a shift in his soul. He spent more time outdoors, connecting with nature, teaching his children the importance of kindness and conservation. On rare occasions, when the world grew quiet, Mike would look out into the snowy distance and wonder if the bear was still out there, if it remembered him, if it too felt the weight of that moment they had shared. And though he would never see the bear again, one thing was certain: the Arctic and the bond he shared with that magnificent creature would live in his heart forever.